Hello, my name is Hwansan Sunim, and this is Sun Meditation in English. So, are we all ready to practice Sun Meditation together? Good. The topic for today's contemplation and meditation is the life of Sun Master Jeongang. Sun Master Jeongang was the teacher of my teacher, Sun Master Songdam. Now, as I've mentioned previously on this program, when I was a junior in college, I got it into my head that I wanted to meet a truly enlightened master and learn meditation from him or her. And in due course, I learned of the name of Sun Master Songdam and arranged to stay at his monastery, now my home temple, Yonghwasa in Incheon. Now, my primary reason for wanting to meet a master and learn meditation was because from a very young age, I had always been plagued by spiritual and existential questions about the meaning of life, the nature of human existence, what a human being is and can possibly become. But I also had other reasons for wanting to learn meditation. At the time, as a student, my dream was to become a writer. I wanted to write novels and short stories and poetry and that kind of thing. And although I had received a fair amount of encouragement and praise from my instructors and professors, still in my own heart, I felt that my writing was shallow and unremarkable. And I thought that if I could learn meditation, I could access a deeper part of my heart and mind and give rise to a more authentic and powerful artistic expression. So that was my second reason for wanting to learn meditation. And I also had a third reason. And the third reason was because I was born and raised in the United States. I was culturally and psychologically American. I only spoke English. And yet, nonetheless, I felt something that was missing in my life. And I wanted to connect with my ancestral homeland and see what kind of cultural legacy, if any, was available to me. So I had these three things on my mind when I applied to, in a sense, applied to go to Yonghwasa. And after graduation, as I've mentioned before, I took a plane trip and arrived at Yonghwasa in the middle of winter. Now, I had been told a couple of things. First was that I could stay at Yonghwasa as a layman, and that I could get a room there and participate in the community life. And the second thing that I was told was that Sun Master Songdam was fluent in English. And as it turned out, none of these things were true. As I found out the day that I actually arrived, they said, if you want to stay here, you have to cut your hair and wear the robes of a monk, even though you don't really plan on becoming a Sunim. So I was already there, so I felt like, well, I can't turn back now. So I became a temporary monk in training, which is called a hengja. So that was the next thing that I learned, of course, was that Songdam Sunim is not fluent in English. He can read and write very well, and he knows a lot of English words, but in-depth dialogue and conversation would be beyond us. So I realized that I would have to learn Korean very quickly. And then the third thing that I realized or learned was that Sun Master Songdam doesn't actually live in Yonghwasa. He only comes out there for the Dharma assemblies to give his Dharma speeches. So I would have to wait several weeks before being able to meet him. And I was put to work almost immediately in the kitchen, which is where the hengjas work, washing dishes and cleaning and helping to prepare meals and that kind of thing. And at the time, the thing that the Sunims were most concerned about was whether I would be able to hear these audio-taped Dharma speeches that were broadcast twice a day throughout the entire monastic compound of Yonghwasa. So actually on the first day, when I arrived at the Yonghwasa office, the monk who met me, who is now my older Dharma brother, he pulled out a cassette recorder. That's the technology that was available back then. And he popped in a cassette tape and started to play this Dharma speech. And what I heard was this old guy who was very wild and very free and spontaneous and improvisational. And he was screaming and shouting like he was scolding someone, and then right away he'd switch and be kind of cooing in this very gentle, sing-song, rhythmical way that actually reminded me of the way my mother used to hum when she worked at home. And sometimes he would chant, and sometimes he would even sing. And it was really just the most amazing thing. And it was a masterful vocal performance, even though I couldn't hear a word that was being said. But even more amazing or more impressive than that was something in the quality of his voice. I had the sense that he was, completely sincere and authentic and earnest and honest. He wasn't trying to pretend to be better than he really was. He wasn't vain. He wasn't embarrassed about anything. There seemed to be no shame. He could just show himself as he really was. And it seemed that he was speaking directly from his heart. And that really struck me. I thought, I wish I could write this way, speak directly from the heart. I wish I could be this way. So the Sunim, he was watching me and he asked me, well, can you understand what he's saying? And I said, no, I can't hear a word he's saying. But this is incredible. This is one of the most amazing things I've ever heard. Is this Dam Sunim? And he said, no, this isn't Dam Sunim. This is Changang Sunim, Dam Sunim's teacher. I was like, oh, okay. Well, can I meet Changang Sunim? They were like, no, you can't. He passed away. He died in 1975. I was like, oh, wow, I'd really like to have met him. And the Sunim says, yeah, we feel the same way too. I later learned that Sun Master Changang is unique among modern Sun Masters. He had inherited, as an enlightened master, he had inherited sort of the Sun Buddhist tradition of Sun dialogue that many of us are familiar with. But he had also picked up much of the native vocal musical traditions of his home province, which was Jeollado. So he could sing so-called Korean opera or pansori. He also knew folk songs, and he was also deeply versed in the narrative storytelling traditions of his home region. And he brought it all into one whole in his Dharma speeches. And his Dharma speeches were designed to convey, to express his enlightened human heart, and also to inspire the awakening of it in the listener. So years later, many years later, when I was, by then I had become an attendant of Dam Sunim, I told him, I talked about my first impression of Sun Master Sun Master Changang, and he said to me, Sun Master Changang has such spiritual power that even if you can't understand his words, you can still hear him. And I found that to be true. And the purpose of today's program now is to share this experience of Sun Master Changang with the larger world, to tell of his life and what meaning it can hold for us. So why don't we enter into guided meditation? So once again, assume sun meditation posture. Look straight forward with a soft gaze. And now we'll enter preparation breathing. In preparation breathing, we inhale through the nose. So inhale together through the nose and fill your chest. Hold. And exhale through the mouth. Now we engage the hwadu, I mo ko, which, as you recall, means what is this? So inhale, hold, and then on the exhale, I mo ko. As always, I will ask everyone here and our viewers at home to continue to meditate while we contemplate the life of Sun Master Changgang. So continue to inhale, hold, and then exhale. Sun Master Changgang was born in 1898 to a family of small-time farmers in a rural town in South Jeollado province, which is the southern agricultural region of Korea. When he was 7, he lost his mother. And his father quickly remarried, and he was raised by a stepmother. And he tells us that he didn't communicate that well with his stepmother. She fed him and clothed him properly, but it sounds like that they didn't really understand each other and they couldn't get into a mother-child relationship. Probably because Sun Master Changgang Sunim was in a state of grieving. Nonetheless, Changgang Sunim describes himself as a very playful, bright, mischievous little boy who liked to actually steal things. And he was always getting scolded by his stepmother, and he felt that he was scolded too much. He was beaten very severely on a regular basis. So he had this difficulty, and I also get the sense that he was mischievous, that he stole things because I think he needed attention after such an early and tragic loss of his mother. Another difficulty in his life was that even at a very young age, he began to realize how intelligent he was, and he wanted to feed his hungry mind, but his stepmother was not interested in educating him. So he begged her to send him to school, but she kept him at home, probably to work on chores in a busy farming family. And so he was sad and lonely at the same time as he was playing around. And he had this kind of irrepressible personality. So ultimately, he actually taught himself how to read and write. Now, there are people in history who have done that, but nonetheless, I think that's kind of a remarkable achievement for a child. When you think about it, if there's no one standing next to you telling you that these circles and lines on a page mean this sound in the language that you hear around you and in the language that you speak, if no one points out that connection, that's a hard connection to make, to go from these visual signs and symbols to what you're hearing through your ears, to make that connection. But somehow he did it, and I think he was able to do it because he was naturally very brilliant. So he did manage to learn how to read and write at a rudimentary level, but in his lifetime he never achieved a high level of education. This was something that he always rued and was sad about. He had a brother. His father and stepmother had a child together, so he had a younger half brother named Wonmyeong when he was 9 years old, and they lived together as a family. And it sounds like Changgang Sunim was having a very hard time in his heart growing up as a child, because he tells us that when he was 11 years old, he went to a nearby waterfall, climbed up to the top, and was very seriously considering killing himself. He felt that if he died, he could rejoin his mother. So he tells us that he stood at the edge of the waterfall and he called out to his mother. He said, "Mommy, when you had to go, couldn't you have taken me as well?" But he couldn't get himself to jump, so he returned home and he lived with his family. When he was 14, he lost his father. His father died, and his stepmother ran away to remarry, to marry someone else, leaving him and his half-brother Wonmyeong at home. So their father's property was taken over by some distant relatives who came in to live with them. And at that point, Changgang Sunim's life became more of a nightmare. He and his younger brother, Wonmyeong, were treated with extreme neglect and even abuse. They were put into an unheated shed full of fleas and lice, where they were just tortured by the fleas and lice all night long. They were not fed properly, they were not clothed properly, they were not educated, and on top of that, they were beaten regularly, not only by the adults, but by their older cousins, who were supposed to be their playmates. So after almost 2 years of this, Jeonggang-sim couldn't take it anymore. So he took his brother, Wonmyung, and they ran away from home. They literally went out into the world with literally nothing but the clothes on their back, nothing to eat, and they just started walking. And they walked for miles and miles and miles, and what they did was Jeonggang-sim went to look for his stepmother's older sister, hoping to be taken in. But as soon as the two brothers got there, the sister ran out and just kind of screamed at them and very harshly rejected them. Didn't even give them a meal, didn't even let them sleep over, just sent them packing on the road again. So Jeonggang Sunim and Wonmyung went walking and walking again for mile after mile. And this time they went to look for their father's oldest sister, again hoping to be taken in. And again, the result was the same. They were kicked out right away, and sort of the aunt came out screaming, and sent them off. So again, they were alone and lost in the world. So this time, Jeonggang-sim set off on the road again, taking his brother in tow, and this time they went and found the stepmother who had abandoned them. And when they found her, with her new husband in her new house, Jeonggang Sunim committed his brother back to her because he was her biological son. And then Jeonggang Sunim turned around and left again. And at this time it was autumn, winter was approaching, and he tells us that he wandered around, this little boy, 13, 14 years old. He was wandering around looking for a place to stay and trying to find a way to live in the world. And after wandering around for a while, he found himself a job as a kind of apprentice at a bellows furnace, making brassware in a kind of social welfare charity center that gave housing to vagrants and homeless people. So what he did was he worked this bellows furnace to make brass dishes and bowls and cups and that kind of thing. And he tells us that at that time people recognized his brilliance. He learned it very, very quickly, and in a very short while he became the best one in that sort of brassware production facility, which was actually just a little group of furnaces. And he could make brassware of better quality in a shorter amount of time than anyone else. So that they were very impressed by him and they wanted to keep him. But he only stayed on for a few months, and in the following spring, he took the money that he had gathered and he returned to his hometown. And he arranged to pay for a memorial service for his recently departed father. And he tells us that he was very proud that he was able to do that. They had treated him like this, lost, unworthy tramp. And for him to come back with money in his pocket and a new suit and to be able to show to them that he was a man of ability who could make his way in the world meant a lot to him. And to be able to honor his father through this memorial service. So he did that, and then he left his town again. And this time he decided to get work as a street vendor. Now, a street vendor in Korea at that time, at the dawn of the 20th century, was considered extremely lowly work. It was like one cut above being a thief or a con artist. The street vendors of that time were known to sell deficient products. They were known to deceive their customers. And Jeonggang Sunim tells us that because he was so clever, he even at a very young age, he had this remarkable gift of communication to be able to persuade people or out-argue them. So he figured he could get away with it, that he was clever enough and persuasive enough to make his living as a street vendor. But there was a Sunim that he knew named Hwansan Sunim. And this Sunim saw him about to become a street vendor, and he went up to him. He went up to Jeonggang Sunim. He said, you can't do this. You can't be a street vendor. That's no way for a person to live. And then Jeonggang Sunim said, well, what else can I do? And Hwansan Sunim said, you can become a Sunim. That's a decent and worthy way to live. And Jeonggang Sunim had actually thought of this when he had left home. This is something that he had already wanted to do. But a laborer, an adult laborer that he met, told him that his social station was too lowly, that you had to have a higher position in society to become a Sunim. So he thought that it was unavailable to him. So he asked the Sunim, he says, you can really do this for me. I can really become a Sunim. He says, yeah, just come follow me. So he followed Pyeonho Sunim, and the Sunim took him to a temple called Gwanumsa. And for a brief period of time, Jeonggang Sunim began a life as a monk in training, studying Buddhist scriptures and getting ready for a life as a Sunim. But he was very turned off by the headmaster Sunim there, who was kind of, he wasn't adhering to the monastic principles and rules. He was going out at night and carousing, and Jeonggang Sunim was very unimpressed and very disappointed, and he actually wanted to live as a true Sunim, so he left Gwanumsa. And by this time he was 16 years old, and what he did was he went over to Hwansan and he ordained there. So why don't we take a break now, and when we get back, we'll continue with the story of Jeonggang Sunim's life. And once again, I ask you to continue to meditate as you listen to the story of this extraordinary master's life. So as I said, Jeonggang Sunim was 16 years old, and he had ordained at Hwansan, one of the most respected and venerated monasteries in Korea. And for the first time, probably in his life, he was living in a stable social environment, in a stable community, and he was receiving an education. He and his fellow novice monks, his hengjas, were learning the Buddhist scriptures. And he made friends with them. And he tells us that his personality at that time was the same as it has always been. He was still playful and mischievous. He still liked to steal things. And he was still, very bright. And so he was living there. And one summer, this girl showed up. She came up from Busan, and her name was Dogan. So Dogan. And she was a very interesting young woman. She was one of the first modern Korean women. She had voluntarily rejected conventional, traditional notions of Korean womanhood. And she wanted to be a modern woman and live in a more liberal way. And so she wore Western clothes, she wore European shoes, she wore her hair in a modern Western style, and she liked to drink with the boys, with the Sunims. She liked to go out drinking with them, and to them, to these monks and lay people in this secluded monastic community, it was like she was an alien that had stepped off of a UFO. Everyone was staring at her hair, her clothes, the way she talked, the way she walked, the way she addressed everyone. So everyone was very kind of fascinated with her, and they paid her a lot of attention. Now, Jeonggang Sunim had a friend, a close friend, and his friend's name was Kim Bong-yun. And Bong-yun was considered sort of the brightest and the most handsome of all the young monks, the one that had the brightest future. And as it turns out, Bong-yun and Dogan, their eyes met, and they struck up a special kind of friendship. There seemed to be an attraction there. And he would show her around their monastery. And there was a lot of idle gossip going around, but it wasn't malicious. There was a feeling of a close-knit community. Everyone knew each other, and the lines between the monastic world and the secular world were not as sharply delineated back then. So people saw this young woman with this young monk, sort of drawn to each other, and they kind of say, maybe they'll get married. Maybe they'll get married and have a family together, and that would be kind of nice. So the summer wore on, and people gossiped, and this kind of thing went along. And one night, Dogan, the girl, went out drinking, which, as I said, she liked to do. And while she was gone in the middle of the night, Bong-yun sneaked into her room. And he hid under her blankets, thinking that he'd wait for her. And while he was waiting for her, he fell asleep. And in the middle of the night, she comes back, flushed, a little drunk. She walks into her room and she sees a stranger under the blankets, and she gives, she screams out. She's totally surprised, and her scream startles him awake. He sits upright, and the most inexplicable thing happens. He has a complete mental breakdown. He completely loses his mind. He starts to babble. He starts to act very wild, violently at times, breaking things, running around. And all of a sudden, it's a complete nightmare. And what had begun as a source of idle gossip, maybe they like each other, maybe they'll get married, was now an outright scandal. Now they were saying this young girl came up from, this strange young girl came up and she made this monk crazy. So Dogan had to go back to Busan, and the monks at Hwansan were now stuck with a full-blown medical problem. So they tried to treat Bongyun with the therapies that were available at the time, which was basically acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. None of it worked. He was getting sicker and sicker. More and more delusional, more and more wild. They didn't know what to do with him. And this was just a different time in Korean history, a different time in the history of the world. They didn't have modern medical facilities or a modern medical perspective on things. They only knew what they knew. And the only thing that they knew to do was to tie this poor boy to a tree in the middle of the courtyard. And every day, Hwansan Sunim came out and to look at his friend, tied to a tree. And every day, this poor boy, Bongyun, grew sicker and sicker. He wouldn't eat, he wouldn't sleep. He grew weaker and weaker, and it was clear that he was dying. And Hwansan Sunim watched his dear friend die right in front of his eyes, day after day after day. And this had a profound effect on Hwansan Sunim.
그런 사이에 뭐 말을 해자 벌써 미쳐버렸는데 어떻게 할 자간도 없고 그래가지고 그동안은 대구로 나가버린 뒤에 이 아이는 그만 미쳐가지고는 불 뛰면서 그 야단을 쳐서 꽉 묶어놓고는 그만 뭐 시도를 해봐도 안 되고 침을 놓아봐도 안 되고 별별 짓을 다 해봐도 안 되었습니다. 그러다가 죽었지 별 수가 없지. 안 죽을래 안 죽을 수도 없지. 뭐가 내놓을 수도 없고 끌어놓을 수도 없고 그건 죽기는 마련이라. 지둥나무다 매놓으면 지둥나무를 끌 수도 끊을 수도 없고 완전 나중에는 죽을 때 얼굴을 본지 그 얼굴이 기가 막히지. 세상에 볼 수가 없지. 유혈도 모두 그대로 맺혀져 나와서 모두 밖으로 핑겨서 기가 다 지긋한 생애를 있다가 그렇게 죽는 것을 보았습니다. 그렇게 화장해 버린 뒤에는 그런 불쌍하게 어린아이를 죽었으니까 초대를 지낸다고. 무슨 선회인가 무슨 죄인가 죄를 지낸 뒤 하여간 지금 부모한테 기별했더니 부모가 와서 그 통곡을 하고 우는 거. 아이 3일 현황제 법문에 응애 스님이 이 법문을 하시는데 인제 법문은 뭐 아무것도 아니야. 그 어른은 지식이 훌륭한 어른인데 올라가서 참 그 어른도 그때 나이가 70은 다 못 되었어도 그래도 그 70된 어른이 설국을 떠. 그 복문이 때 어린아 목숨 잃어버린 데 대해서 이 개송을 해주는데 개송이요? 수행의 막대 뒷모반 고리 신부리 이갱소년이니란 인시 것이 일기신환이면 지옥 시장 기등한 곳.
So he was profoundly shocked. And the monks of Hwansan took the body of this poor boy up into the mountains and they performed a cremation ceremony for him. And Hwansan Sunim tells us that he watched the ashes of the smoke that was once the body of his friend swirl up into the air in like a whirlwind. And a Sunim at the time, the headmaster, his name was Kim Unge Sunim, gave a Dharma speech at the conclusion of the cremation ceremony. And Hwansan Sunim tells us that when he heard the gatha, or Buddhist verse, that concluded the speech, at that time he experienced a sudden aspiration to gain enlightenment. So Hwansan Sunim heard this, and now he knew he wanted to meditate. He wanted to meditate, gain enlightenment, and free himself from the suffering of birth and death. And he begged the elders in his monastery to give him permission to go to a meditation monastery. But they wouldn't let him because he was too young and he hadn't completed his studies. But he begged them and begged them and begged them, and finally they let him go. So at the age of 19, he was admitted into Chikchisa Meditation Monastery, which also is a very venerated meditation monastery. And what we have to understand here is that Hwansan Sunim was experiencing a heightened spiritual crisis. He had felt the impermanence of human existence, the impermanence of all things, and this had pushed him into a full-blown spiritual crisis. He was not in a normal frame of mind. So when he went to Chikchisa, he immediately set to practice, and his level of practice was very intense. He tells us that he would only eat a few mouthfuls for breakfast and then just meditate all the way through without moving until lunchtime. Then he would eat a few mouthfuls for lunch and then meditate again all the way to dinner. He would eat a little bit for dinner and then meditate again deep into the night. So he meditated in this incredibly intense, frenzied way. And initially, the community of monks and lay people around him were skeptical about him. They were a little bit cynical. They thought, this little kid's come here, he's showing off. He's going to wear himself out. He's going to get sick. But Hwansan Sunim just kept at it day after day after day without wavering. And he won their respect. They began to think, this is not a normal child. This is not a normal kid. There's something about him. We need to support his practice. So he was practicing very, very strongly like that. But the thing was, he had never been formally trained in meditation. So he didn't know how to do the breathing. He only knew what he had briefly read in his brief education. So when he held his hwadu, he held it up here in his head instead of down here in his dantian, in his lower belly. And what happened was, now this is according to traditional Asian notions of biology, but what happened was he disrupted the flow of energy through his body, and he got sick in an ailment which is called in Korean sangi, and translated into English that means elevated chi, our vital energy. And what that means is there's an overaccumulation of chi or vital energy in the head. And that gives rise to some really awful symptoms. Even mild cases of sangi, you can have really bad headaches, and your head throbs, and your face turns red, and you get bloodshot. But because Hwansan Sunim had such a fiery personality, and because he was in such a heightened state of spiritual ardor, his level of sangi was life-threatening. He began to bleed torrentially from his nose. I mean, just poured out. And when he blocked up his nose, he would bleed out of his mouth. So he was bleeding through his nose and his mouth day after day, and people around him were starting to think, this kid's gonna die. And but he wouldn't leave. He held on, and he tells us that after a while, there was no more blood left to bleed. His face had turned completely white. He was like a walking corpse. People were thinking he was gonna keel over any second. He would just bleed a little bit now. But he still kept practicing. And he finished out the meditation season. And after he finished out the season, he went down to a temple called Pomosa, and he stayed there for a while. And he was at this point very worried that he was going to die, but also he was intent on gaining enlightenment. So he stayed there for a while, and then he recalled a dream that he had when he was at Jikjisa. In the dream, he heard a gunshot coming from the west. So he took that to mean that he should go find Manggong Sunim, who was one of the most celebrated and illustrious sun masters of his time. Manggong Sunim was living at a place called Bodoksa. So he got up and he went to Bodoksa. And he went over there, and he tried to live with them and participate in the community activity, but he found that he was just really, really very weak now. So he just kind of hung on, and time passed, and he managed to stay for probably 5 or 6 months. And he finished out the summer retreat, and then after that he went by himself on the road, and he was wandering as meditation monks do in the autumn and spring, wandering along through the mountains, he tells us. And as he was walking along a mountain ridge, he was pondering the Sun Buddhist teachings that he had learned. And out of nowhere, as he pondered these teachings, suddenly he experienced great spiritual awakening. He experienced enlightenment. And he was completely immersed in the bliss and vitality of enlightenment. And it completely woke him up, and he decided then that he would have to go to Hwansan, another temple in that area. So he walked toward Hwansan, and he reached Hwansan by nightfall. And he went into the Bell Pavilion. And he stayed up all night, he tells us, in the Bell Pavilion, kind of intoxicated by this heightened spiritual state of his enlightenment. And in the course of the night, he composed his Enlightenment Verse. Now, the Enlightenment Verse is a part of Sun Buddhist tradition. Traditionally in Sun Buddhism, a disciple practices under a master. And when the disciple experiences enlightenment, he is tested by the master through what's called Sun question and answer, a kind of Dharma dialogue, where the hwadus, various kongans, are given to the disciple, and the disciple has to answer them. And if he answers all the kongans successfully, then he is asked to compose an enlightenment verse. So Sun Master Changgang was very, very proud of this enlightenment verse that he composed, because you have to remember his education was very inadequate. And yet, in his enlightenment, somehow he managed to compose this very elegant, beautiful poem in classical Chinese. So in time, his enlightenment verse became very well respected within Sun Buddhism as really a shining example of this type of spiritual art. So I will now read to you in English the translation of his enlightenment verse. Last night, moonlight filled the pavilion. Outside the window, a reed flower autumn. The Buddhas and the ancestral masters have lost their bodies and their lives. Flowing water is coming past the bridge. So with the composition of this enlightenment verse, Sun Master Changgang successfully attained enlightenment against all odds, with almost no help, almost moving by himself. This is almost unprecedented in Buddhist history, and in fact, most masters say that this is impossible. And his age at the time of his enlightenment was 23, the age that most of us are when we just graduate college. Today's program is actually the first part of a special 2-part program dedicated to sharing the life of Changgang Sunim with a modern international audience, and also to discussing the significance or meaning of this life to us who live in the modern world. So in our next episode, we'll contemplate what meaning and significance his life, the way he lived, the way he practiced, can have for us who live here in the 21st century. So I want to thank you all very much for participating in today's program. This particular program has great personal meaning for me because it's the first time I'm able to convey the teachings of this spiritual master who I really, really wanted to meet. And I'm just very grateful to be able to convey it today in English. So I will once again thank all of you who participated here, and thank all of you viewers at home for participating. And I ask you to join us again in our next episode when we continue to follow the life of Sun Master Changgang. Okay? So I will conclude again with our customary Buddhist greeting. May we all attain the Buddha.
잠도 안 오고 그 경계가 그만 그 뭐 눈도를 돌이킨 곳마다 그대로 그뿐이고 눈 안 돌이키면 없나? 앉으면 있고 서면 없나? 아 이거 참 견성에 그날 탈을 건네뜨다가 앉아 견성했다고 그날 밤에 태안사 청중에 건일다가 하나 진 것이요. 자기야 얼만 누다 창외 놓아주다 불조 상신맹요 유수가결연이란 벌러 듣지 마라. 무식한 내가 걸린 걸 봐. 강사도 모두 있은 게 강사 지견을 붙여보란 말이야.